Well, hello everyone. Good to virtually see you again. We are continuing with the second section of the class. We're now in chapter 23, and we're actually at a point in the book where we're going to have our feet in two chapters. So if you've been looking at the book, you'll notice that chapter 23 deals with the domestic side of the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson, and then chapter 24 deals with foreign policy during those same three presidencies. And so it's sort of, the book breaks things up topically, domestic politics and foreign policy. Of course, that's not the way the world works. Presidents and the country have to deal with domestic and foreign issues simultaneously. And so we're not going to keep that divide. So we're going to go chronologically and look at the presidency of first Teddy Roosevelt with this lecture. And we're going to look at both his domestic and his foreign policy. So we're going to look at him in both chapter 23 and 24. Then in our next lecture, we're going to do the same thing for William Howard Taft, looking at him at home and abroad. So again, chapter 23 and 24. And then we're going to look at Woodrow Wilson, spending relatively little time on his domestic presidency in chapter 23, concentrating more on his foreign policy in chapter 24. But basically for the next three lectures, if you're trying to read ahead or read along in the book, we are going to be both in chapter 23 and chapter 24 at the same time. So we begin this lecture by talking about the rise and the impact of Theodore Roosevelt, certainly one of the most consequential, one of the most famous, one of the most beloved of all American presidents. Now, he does not come to the presidency by a traditional route. William McKinley, who had, you will remember, been elected in 1896, stood for re-election in 1900. The country, of course, was still aglow in the aftermath of victory over Spain in the Spanish-American War, America's entry onto the world stage, and its acquisition of a colonial empire. The difficulties in the Philippines were just beginning to get serious. And so there was very little doubt that McKinley was going to win a second term. The Republican Party dominates national politics. It dominates the House, or rather the Senate and the presidency, if not the House of Representatives. And you have here a popular president who's just won a war, and so he was a shoo-in. But of course, he needs a vice president. And it was not the custom in the 19th century or the first half of the 20th century to keep the vice president that you had in your first term. Vice presidents were considered to be very inconsequential. Only twice or relatively few times had the vice president actually had to take on the presidential duties. That had only happened four times, twice by assassination, two times by death of natural causes. And nonetheless, vice presidents were brought onto the ticket to attract votes. They balanced the ticket. If you had a northerner, you wanted a southerner. An easterner, you wanted a westerner. If you had somebody who was older, you wanted somebody that was younger, that sort of thing. And so vice presidents were considered to be electorally expendable. And what the Republicans wanted to do in 1900 was to remind everybody about that splendid little war in Spain way back in 1898. And they did that by making Theodore Roosevelt of New York the vice presidential candidate of the Republican Party. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, had become famous as one of the leaders of the Rough Riders. He had, commanded those troops during the Battle of San Juan Hill. He had received a lot of press, and so this was a great way to remind everybody that you had a wartime president and a wartime hero running together on the ticket at 1900. Teddy Roosevelt was also from New York, which of course had a lot of electoral votes, and so is a swing state. But Teddy Roosevelt was also kind of brash, and he was opinionated, and he didn't necessarily follow the party's orthodoxy, and that was irritating to a lot of the party's elders. And well, while they had to recognize Roosevelt's notoriety, Roosevelt's popularity, they also kind of found him to be a pain in their neck. And what better way to, sort of shut him up and shunt him off to the side than to make him the vice presidency, which in that day and age was never considered to be the stepping stone to the White House. It was, in fact, usually considered to be the end of somebody's political career. I mean, you had technically held the second highest job in the land, even though if it was a job that didn't have much power and it didn't have much influence. But if you weren't going to go from there to become president, then where do you go? And the answer was usually you went into political obscurity. So there was a little bit of political manipulation that was going on here. Not that any of it mattered. McKinley and Roosevelt easily won in November of 1900. McKinley gets his second term, but he doesn't get to enjoy it for very long. So he's elected in November of 1900. And he's inaugurated in March of 1901, and that September, he's attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, and this was something he liked to do. Remember, McKinley had the common touch. He was really a man of the people. He liked to ride the streetcars in Washington, D.C. He liked to go to events and shake hands and meet the ordinary people. He and his wife, walked the sidewalks of the Capitol, holding hands, window shopping. I mean, this is the kind of person that McKinley was. He was not a pretentious soul. He liked the American people. He liked mixing and mingling with them. So here he is at this Pan American Exposition, this great big sort of fair, to display the wonders of the age. This was something that was very popular at the end of the 19th and the first 3 decades of the 20th century. And the president is standing in an open field, greeting a long line of well-wishers, people coming up to meet the president, to shake his hand. And while he's standing there and he's doing this, a anarchist comes up, unemployed labor and anarchist, and he shoots McKinley in the back. The man, of course, is apprehended. He is, of course, tried, and he's executed. When they ask him why he shot McKinley, he had no personal grievance with the president. He had no real beef with the president's policies. He was an anarchist. He didn't believe we should have a president. He didn't believe people needed government in their lives and that sort of thing. So it was a ideologically motivated murder more than a politically motivated murder in a way. And McKinley did not die immediately. The bullet lodged in the small of his back, and obviously surgery was required. And medical personnel decided, rather than put him in a car and drive him some hours to the nearest hospital that had a newfangled machine called an X-ray machine, that was the bad idea. And the roads were unpaved and they were bumpy, and there was great fear that the president wouldn't survive the trip. So instead, they took him to the nearest doctor's office that they could find, which happened to belong to a gynecologist, obviously well appointed for its primary task, and not necessarily well suited to perform surgery on the nation's chief executive. So it took almost as long to prepare to do the surgery in the nearby office as it would have taken to drive the president to the hospital. And although that was bad, it got worse because without an X-ray machine to locate the bullet, the doctors did it in the old-fashioned way, which was with long, thin metal probes that they pushed into the wound to try and find the bullet and then go in with their fingers and to extract it. And this was in the era before there were antiseptics. There was no knowledge of germs and bacteria. People knew that wounds got infected, but they didn't know how that happened. There was anesthesia, so the president thankfully was unconscious for all of this. And they extracted the bullet and they sewed the president up, and he seemed to be on the road to recovery. But of course, the probes and the doctor's fingers, and they weren't wearing masks or gloves or anything like that in that day and age, had introduced bacteria into the wound, and very soon a lethal infection set in. And 8 days later, William McKinley was dead. He had gotten to serve only a few months of his second term. And that meant that for the 5th time in American history, the vice president has to step up and become the president. So rather by tragic accident, Theodore Roosevelt, who is popularly known as Teddy, although he didn't like to be called Teddy, he much preferred to be called Theodore. Theodore Roosevelt has become the president of the United States. And at the time he becomes president, he is the youngest man ever to hold that office. And that is a record that he retains to this day. He's the youngest man ever to become office. He's not going to be the youngest man ever to be elected to office because, of course, he's not elected to the presidency. That record's going to belong to John F. Kennedy, who was a little bit younger than Theodore Roosevelt is going to be when he actually gets elected to the presidency in his own right in 1904, an event, of course, that no one could have foreseen. Vice presidents who'd had to step up and become president had not been very successful in American history, and nobody quite knew what to expect from Roosevelt. The party leaders, of course, thought that they would pull his strings. He would be a figurehead, a non-entity, that sort of thing. And, of course, this was a serious miscalculation because Teddy Roosevelt was going to prove to be his own man. And he's going to be very different from most of the men who had occupied the White House, at least since the age of Andrew Jackson. With youth and opinion is going to come capability and vigor and energy and determination. And Roosevelt, of course, did the thing that every vice president does when he winds up becoming president through death or assassination. He promises to carry on in the footsteps of his predecessor, the guy who actually got elected by the American people to be president. He had an agenda. I will pursue that agenda. And usually that's said, but it's impossible to do because this accidental president does not really have any clout. He doesn't have a base of his own. But with Teddy Roosevelt, he is going to keep that promise. In fact, he's going to keep that promise with a vengeance. He's going to insert energy and enthusiasm and determination into meeting those goals that even William McKinley would have been unlikely to do if he had not been murdered. And as a consequence of that, Teddy Roosevelt is probably going to be the most popular American president in office between Franklin Roosevelt, who is his distant cousin in the 1930s, and Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. Most presidents are popular in one fashion or another when they're elected, but you spend enough time as President of the United States, 4 years or 8 years, you're going to make a lot of people angry, you're going to disappoint a lot of people are going to disagree with you. If you want a job that's going to trash your reputation, become President of the United States, because by the time you exit the office, half of the American people, in all likelihood, are going to despise you and hate you, and you're going to, of course, be savaged by the opposing political party. You can get redeemed after your presidency. Enough time goes by, the issues, lose their passion, and people get more objectivity. But that happens for some presidents. It's not happened to all of them. But being popular while you're actually in office, being wildly popular while you're actually in office, is kind of a rare thing. And yet Roosevelt is going to pull it off. And one of the reasons he's going to do that is because he's young, and that is something kind of new for the country. It's been a long time since we had a president who was in his 40s. But more than that, Teddy Roosevelt sort of epitomized, he embodied the new America at the dawn of the 20th century. Like the country he was to lead, he was self-confident and he was idealistic. He was of a progressive bent. He believed in energy and efficiency. He was vigorous and flamboyant, well-read and opinionated. He was also well-written. Teddy Roosevelt's going to write 43 books in his lifetime. And there's no president that even comes close to that record. We might have had presidents who haven't read 43 books in their lifetime. And because he was well-read and he was well-written, Teddy Roosevelt had no doubt about what he believed in and what he thought. He embraced the progressive idea that it was possible to make America a better place, to make it a fairer place, a more just place, a more efficient place, and all of that harnessed to the idea of making America and Americans richer, to make American life better, and to make America more powerful and more influential and more secure in the world. He was also a marvelous speaker. Teddy Roosevelt was great one-on-one or in front of a huge audience. He had a voice that would carry if there was no microphone. Of course, microphones were just showing up, but Teddy Roosevelt knew how to turn a phrase. He knew how to give a speech, and presidents didn't have speech writers in that day and age. So everything the man said came out of his own head. And he had that oratorical touch that is so important to a successful presidency or a successful political career. If you don't sound like you know what you believe in, if you don't sound like you have conviction in what you say, if you don't sound like you have a passion for the causes or the policies that you pursue, if you don't come across as articulate, you therefore don't come across as competent, you don't come across as believable, and people are more likely to find ammunition with which to attack you, and they are more likely to find reason to doubt you. This is not a problem that Teddy Roosevelt had. Roosevelt, of course, also had a healthy ego. He knew he was smart. He knew he was capable. He knew he was a war hero. He knew he had the power of the presidency. The man, as I pointed out, did not lack for self-confidence whatsoever, and he loved attention. He loved being in the political limelight. So the job of president was one that suited him very well. And that put some people off. Roosevelt is going to be a powerful figure, and there are people who are inclined to view powerful figures with suspicion. There are people who are inclined to view Roosevelt's authority as destructive to America, who were jealous of it, or who did not like its effectiveness because they wanted to pursue different policies, or they belonged to a different political party. And then there were always people who are not going to like a strong personality. And there was a quip that went around that Teddy Roosevelt loved attention so much, he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. He had to be at the center of things. But as it turns out, being at the center of things came very naturally to Theodore Roosevelt, and it's going to have a profound effect on his presidency and therefore the country. Another thing that Teddy Roosevelt had that's important to a successful presidency, he had an eye for talent. He had an eye for talent. He spotted men who were capable and competent and energetic like himself, and brought them into his cabinet. Elihu Root, who will begin as Secretary of War and later become Secretary of State, considered to be one of the greatest American Secretaries of War in our history. William Howard Taft, who we will get to know even more, but had been head of the colonial government in the Philippines, would replace Root as Secretary of War, do a very good job. Roosevelt is going to appoint Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. to the Supreme Court, one of the most famous and most revered Supreme Court justices in American history. And when you can bring in a competent, energetic team like that, it is a force multiplier for the president himself. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to have a vast impact on the country. By the time he leaves office 8 years later, nothing politically is really going to be the same. Teddy Roosevelt is going to expand America's role in the world and change our foreign policy very profoundly. He's also going to put the national government in the role of doing things that it had never done before. He's fundamentally going to change the nature of the federal government. He's going to bring progressivism, or at least some of progressive tenets, into the national government. But two things in particular are going to stand out about Teddy Roosevelt. One is his foreign policy, which is going to be very militarized and is going to win the name gunboat diplomacy. Teddy Roosevelt's foreign policy is going to be known as gunboat diplomacy, and it is kind of for that he is better remembered today at the dawn of the 21st century. But at the time, Teddy Roosevelt is going to be much more famous as the Trust Buster. So that's the nickname that's going to attach itself to Teddy Roosevelt, the Trust buster. And that is going to break new ground for the U.S. government. Now, Teddy Roosevelt did not necessarily set out to be a trust buster. He really had no problem with the idea of trust as an organizational model for these giant industries that had been created by the Second Industrial Revolution. He thought it was sort of a natural evolution that you would have large concentrations of labor and capital. Large concentrations of labor and capital were necessary to do things like mass-produce steel, to mass-produce oil, to connect a continent with a railroad network, to bring the technologies and the benefits of the Second Industrial Revolution to the American people, no matter where they lived. But what Roosevelt did have a problem with was the abuse of the power that the robber barons and the trust accrued to themselves. And of course, this is something that Americans have been rumbling about for some time. Eventually, people begin to get nervous about men and now women who are unelected, who are therefore accountable to no one, having enormous control over what become vital components of people's daily lives, like the delivery of fuel or travel or communication or that sort of thing. And we see the echoes of this today when people talk about Amazon, or they talk about Google, or they talk about Facebook, or these sorts of things. Today it's the technology companies that leave people feeling ill at ease because of their importance in our lives, the power and the wealth that a handful of men who built those and control those hold in their hands, the fear or the suspicion that they use that power unwisely, or that they use it to manipulate and corrupt the political system, and that no one can call them to account, no one can check their power simply because they are so wealthy and they are so influential, and therefore ordinary people cannot combat them. You can't stand up to them. And this was a feeling that was growing about robber barons like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan and others. And Roosevelt shares that point of view. He doesn't dislike these men. In fact, he admires these men and what they have accomplished. But he does come to believe that their power must be curbed, that they cannot continue to act in an unfettered way. And he begins his road to becoming the trust buster in 1901, when he makes a speech or gives an announcement to Congress in which he says the following. And listen to this. I'm not going to ask you to quote it on an exam or something like that, but just listen to what Roosevelt's going to say here. He says, quote, "There's a widespread conviction in the minds of the American people that the great corporations known as trust are, in certain of their features and tendencies, hurtful to the general welfare," unquote. I'm going to read it again. There's a widespread conviction in the minds of the American people. That means that a lot of people believe something. A lot of people feel something. He's not saying it's true. He's not saying they're right. He's just saying there's a perception. People believe something. What do they believe? That the great corporations known as trust. Well, great corporations can mean a couple of things, can it? It can mean great as in large, or it can mean great as in wonderful, fantastic, impressive. Take your pick. That these great corporations known as trust are, in certain of their features and tendencies. Not everything about them. Not most things about them. Perhaps not even the most important things about them. But in certain of their features and tendencies, they are what? Hurtful to the general welfare. Hurtful. That's a pretty weak phrase, isn't it? Hurtful. Not dangerous, not threatening, but hurtful. Hurt is how you feel when your best friend doesn't wish you happy birthday, for 48 hours after the actual occasion. Hurt is how you feel if somebody, forgets to send you a Christmas card or something. But it's a minor thing. It's something that you'll get over. It's hurt feelings. Have this perception of being, kind of surface, not terribly important. So what is Roosevelt really saying here? A lot of people believe, they could be right, they could be wrong, that the great corporations corporations, take that however you want, are in some ways hurtful to the general welfare. It's not a particularly damning statement. It was factually accurate, but it was really weak tea in what it was getting across, except that never before had an American president even said something this remotely critical about the trust and the robber barons. In other words, this critique was unprecedented, and therefore it had an impact beyond all proportion to what Roosevelt is actually saying. And this is not surprising. First matters, right? You remember your first car. You've probably had lots of cars since then, but somehow that first one you remember it. You remember your first apartment. You remember your first significant other. You remember your first kiss. We all remember our first kiss. You've undoubtedly had lots of kisses since then, and some of them have been technically more proficient, and they've been emotionally more significant, or they've been more exciting. But we remember our first kiss. We remember our first significant other. Why? Because they were the first. It was an unprecedented thing. It was the beginning of something, and so it has a particular importance in our memory, in our lives, than all of the redundant examples that are going to follow us. And so, for the first time, an American president has said something negative about the trust, and that sort of threw everybody into a swirl. Oh my gosh, what does he mean by that? Well, Roosevelt was beginning to send the signal that although trust in themselves were not bad, and robber barons in themselves were not bad, in fact, they were important, they were good, they had a great benefit to America and American commerce and America's place in the world, they did need to have their hurtful tendencies checked and controlled so that they worked toward, not against, the public good. They did not harm individual opportunity or corrupt and destroy local enterprise. In short, as far as Teddy Roosevelt was concerned, there are two types of trust. There are good trust and there are bad trust. Good trust and bad trust. True good trust, the ones that play by the rules, that don't abuse their power, that don't try and illegally or unethically smash competition, who treat the consumer fairly. The good trust are the ones that the government's going to support. But there are bad trusts, and there are bad robber barons, and these are the ones that are going to corrupt the system. They're going to smash free enterprise. You're going to abuse their power, and these need to be checked and controlled. Now, in the era of muckraking, Roosevelt hoped that the press alone could manage to force bad industries to reform. However, that really didn't do the trick. It didn't do the trick. The bad industries, the guilty trust, would endure the negative press for a while, knowing that sooner or later the newspapers would turn their attention to something else. The American people would turn their attention to something else. So they just ride out the storm. They had the wealth, they had the power that they could do that. And so if the shame of the public spotlight wasn't going to be enough, then Roosevelt decided he was going to take another step. So in 1903, he goes to the Congress, and he asks it to create a Department of Commerce and Labor. He wants a new federal department, something that's going to be on par with the War Department or the State Department or the Treasury Department or the Interior Department. So this is a big ask. And he wants this Department of Commerce and Labor to be equipped with a Bureau of Corporations, which would investigate business engaged in interstate commerce. Remember, interstate, I-N-T-E-R, is commerce that crosses state lines, and that's the kind of commerce that the Constitution specifically gives the U.S. government the sole authority to regulate. Congress was uncertain about it. It didn't like the idea of creating a new department, a new cabinet-level position with new powers, a new bureaucracy with new expenses. Whatever your reason not to like it, you could find a point to make against it, and Congress refused to act. Now, for most presidents, that would have been the end of it. He asked for something, Congress refuses to give it, there it is, you're done. But Congress is not your ordinary president. And he is a man for whom we could say the ends often justified the means. When he asked for something, he believed that it was necessary and he believed that it was right. And he was not going to allow himself to be stymied by what he would consider to be political cowards, people who couldn't see the need as clearly as he could. And Roosevelt was not going to take defeat. Teddy Roosevelt, in fact, was going to find a way to get what he wanted, and one of his favorite methods of doing so was to use the press. Teddy Roosevelt, the first modern president to really understand how to use the media, how to turn the press in his favor. So he's asked for this Department of Commerce and Labor, this Bureau of Corporations. The Congress is inclined not to give it to him. It seems like it's not going to go anywhere. Why should we listen to this accidental president? It's 1903. In a year, there's going to be an election. This guy's not going to get reelected. Vice presidents who become president through death assassination never get their own term in office, and so he's going to be out of here. We don't have to pay attention. But that was a miscalculation of Teddy Roosevelt as a political actor, as a political tactician, and as a what will soon be an icon for the American people. So what did Teddy Roosevelt do? Well, he invited several gentlemen of the press to an off-the-record interview in the White House. They just, hey, reporters, president, we have to deal with each other all the time. We might as well treat each other as human beings. Why don't you all come by and we'll just have a talk. We'll have lunch and we'll have a talk. And everything will be off the record. We're just going to be guys here, gentlemen, talking to one another. But of course, what reporter goes to the White House to talk to the president and truly considers anything the chief executive says to be off the record? That's not going to really happen. And Roosevelt knew it wasn't going to happen, and that is exactly what he wanted. So they're going back and forth, having their peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and inevitably the question comes up, well, Mr. President, why do you think that the Congress is unwilling to give you this Department of Commerce and Labor that you want? Why do you think Congress is not going to go along with that? And Teddy Roosevelt sort of leaned in and looked at the reporters and he said, gentlemen, I thought we weren't going to talk about politics here, which of course he isn't exactly what he intended to happen. And remember, everything that I say is off the record, right? It's all off the record. Yes, sir, Mr. President, it's all off the record. All right, then, just between you and me, John D. Rockefeller has bought off a bunch of members of Congress. He's bribed them. They're in his pocket. He doesn't want this Department of Commerce and Labor, this Bureau of Corporations, so he's paying them to stand against it. Wow, right? The president has just accused, if in the most oblique fashion, members of the House and the Senate of being corrupted in the employ of John D. Rockefeller, one of the most powerful of all the robber barons. And what reporter is going to hear the president say that part of the Congress is corrupt, and that's why they're blocking my agenda, and keep that off the record? Of course not. They went right back to their press rooms, and they reported it. Not that the president said it, but high-placed administration officials believe, and the story got out. And of course, a lot of the American people already were suspicious of the robber barons. They didn't like them, they feared them, or they resented them. And now you have the press saying that the Roosevelt administration, or at least somebody in the Roosevelt administration, believes that the robber barons are corrupting the Congress and keeping this important innovation that the president wants that's going to hold the robber barons in check from being realized. Well, of course, there was an outcry amongst the public. They found this really easy to believe, and they were furious about it. And the letters and the telegrams started to come in to congressmen, senators. What about it? Are you one of those people? And of course, the pressure on the Congress and the Senate was such that in response to the public outcry, the only thing that they could do to calm the public's anger was to create the very thing that Teddy Roosevelt had asked for. So it created a Department of Commerce and Labor with the Bureau of Corporations. Roosevelt got exactly what he wanted. He got exactly what he wanted. He did an end run around the Congress and the traditional politicians by using the press to speak directly to the American people, who then put pressure on the national legislature to give Teddy Roosevelt what he wanted. And this was a tactic that he was going to use over and over and over again. And so Teddy Roosevelt he creates a new department in the federal government. That is certainly to his credit as being an influential president. But the next thing that he's going to do is going to be even more profound in a way. So remember, as part of the $1 billion Congress, way back in the administration of Benjamin Harrison, so in the early 1890s, the Congress had passed something called the Sherman Antitrust Act that had outlawed monopolies, business combinations in the form of trust or otherwise, who acted to restrain free trade or commerce. So the law's been on the books, but it's never really been used. And if it's been used against small trusts. It's never been turned against the big ones, the real robber barons and that sort of thing. But that weapon has been in the presidential toolbox, right? This is a Department of Justice thing, is going to use the Sherman Antitrust Act if a president was inclined to use it. And Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was. So in 1901, he said there's certain things about some trusts that are hurtful to the general welfare. In 1902, he had the Justice Department bring an antitrust suit against the Northern Securities Company for violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Northern Securities Company was one of those great big railroad trusts that was controlled behind the scenes by John D. Or rather J.P. Morgan, and who owned controlling shares of stock in most of the giant railway companies. And although in theory they were all competitors with each other, in fact they were all part of one great big organization that had enormous power, no true competition, and could act however they wanted. And so clearly they had been doing all sorts of things that violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, but no one had ever called them out on it. Well, now Teddy Roosevelt's Justice Department is going to do that. And so he brings this antitrust suit. And when word of it gets out, Morgan, of course, is furious. So there'd always kind of been an understanding between presidents and robber barons, that the presidents would leave the robber barons alone. The Sherman Antitrust Act would never be used. But now you've got this young whippersnapper who was accidentally in the White House, because McKinley had been assassinated. By the way, it's Teddy Roosevelt who's going to remodel the White House and the presidential office to make it oval. So it's during Roosevelt's time that it becomes the Oval Office. This young whippersnapper in this Oval Office is failing to act, as Morgan said, like a gentleman, unquote. Hey, the elite in society understand how things are supposed to work, and it's not supposed to work like this. So he got on one of his trains and he rushed to the federal Capitol to complain to Roosevelt. Basically, he was going to see Teddy Roosevelt and he was going to put him in his place. He was J.P. Morgan. He was powerful. He was wealthy beyond imagining. He was influential, and he was not going to be pushed around by a president. Teddy Roosevelt agreed to see him. And when Morgan and Roosevelt met, Morgan quickly realized that he had bet his match, that he had underestimated Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt believed that he was the personal representative of the American people. He was the personification of the American government. And he therefore had not only the moral authority and the legal authority, he was in the right. He was in the right. And he was going to do what he thought was necessary. And so he made it very clear that the government was not going to back down on this antitrust suit against the Northern Securities Company. And that was a grave shock to Morgan, who suddenly found himself on his back foot. And before he left the White House, he was the one sort of beginning to grovel. And he asked if the administration had any plans to go after his other giant trust, United States Steel. And Roosevelt, undoubtedly enjoying how the tables had turned, told Morgan, no, we have no plans to go after United States Steel unless it does something that, quote, we regard as wrong, unquote. In other words, not yet, but watch your P's and Q's, Mr. Morgan, because if you do something that I do not approve of, then we are going to act. And the antitrust suit against Northern Securities was pushed through. The railroad companies fought it all the way back to the Supreme Court, and it wasn't until 1904 that it was resolved, but it was resolved in the favor of the Roosevelt administration, and the trust was dissolved by the order of the court. And so Roosevelt has taken the first steps to regulate the trust, and he's going to do more and more and more and more. One of the trusts that he's going to go after is the American Tobacco Company. Another is the DuPont Corporation, the New Haven Railroad, then Standard Oil itself. Which of course everybody had to deal with. Another trust that Roosevelt is going to bust up is the beef trust. And here's a good example of muckraking, because basically what happens is the beef trust was huge. It controlled the slaughterhouses in New York City, or rather in New York City, in Chicago, and therefore it was extremely wealthy, and it was extremely powerful, and Roosevelt is going to go after it, and he's going to break it up. And so Roosevelt, in that first term that was actually William McKinley's, takes a lot of action against the trust, and he is going to win those actions. And this is unprecedented. This is something the American people had never seen before, and it's what earned Roosevelt the name the Trust Buster. Now, remember, Roosevelt doesn't dislike trust. He doesn't dislike robber barons per se. He just wants them to abide by the government's rule, to curb their power. And as long as the robber barons did that, they would find a supportive White House. In fact, J.P. Morgan gave money to Roosevelt's reelection campaign in 1904. And after Roosevelt gets reelected, the administration is going to allow United States Steel to merge with one of its biggest competitors, Tennessee Coal and Iron, which made the U.S. Steel Trust even bigger than it had been before. But remember, it's not just trust in and of themselves that's the problem. It's trusts that behave badly, that do wrong things. And so during his presidency, Teddy Roosevelt is going to initiate 25 antitrust suits. And like I said, he's going to take on some of the biggest ones. And hence the name Trustbuster. What he's doing is unprecedented. It's shocking, and it meets the approval of the American people. So things like this are going to help make Roosevelt extremely unpopular. Another thing that he's going to do that's unprecedented is to begin to side with labor against management in strikes and disputes. So Roosevelt is the guy who sort of leads the way there. And his first experience with labor unrest was a major labor dispute in the coal mines of northeastern Pennsylvania. So this is a vital coal-producing region of the country. And there was a union, the United Mine Workers, led by a guy named John Mitchell, who went on strike demanding better wages, an 8-hour workday, and company recognition of the union and its right to negotiate for its members. And the coal companies refused. So this strike begins sort of like all the others. The workers have demands. Management is unwilling to meet those demands. So you would get the sort of the typical process then. The workers would be fired and replacements would be hired, and the workers, to keep that from happening, would occupy the business and keep it from operating, and that was violation of private property, and so the management would go get an injunction injunction that would order the workers out of the property. They would refuse to go, and the police or the militia would come in to evict them, and inevitably there would be violence, and almost always there would be some politically unsavory types who would be hovering around that managed to insert themselves into it, and all this in the papers would turn people off, and it would basically make it look like the management was, for law and order and stability, and the striking workers were the anarchists, the socialists, the communists trying to tear down society, and this sort of thing. And that never went well for the strikers. But the unions learned from that experience in the second half of the 19th century, so that by the time that the United Mine Workers went out on strike in May of 1902, some 140,000 of them left their jobs, basically shutting down the mines. The UMW's leaders, like Mitchell, have learned we've got to keep the press and the public on our side. So unlike the strikes in the 1890s, there was no violence. There was no bloodshed to turn the public against the strikers. The strikers simply refused to work and asked for better wages, better working conditions, and the right of the union to negotiate for them. And so the UMW came across as asking for very moderate things, what struck a lot of people as very reasonable demands, but still playing by the rule book of the 19th century. The owners of the coal mines absolutely refused to negotiate, and they would not grant any demands. And what this means is that the strike drags on. And as the strike drags on and no coal is being produced, then the stockpiles of coal begin to shrink. And coal was a vital commodity to Americans. This is what moved the trains. It's what moved the ships. It is how people heated their homes. This is what produced the electricity. And of course, as there was less and less coal in stockpiles, then the price began to go up and up and up and up and up. And people did not like that. Winter was coming on, and a crisis was at hand. And at that point, Roosevelt decided that he was going to intervene. And so he asked the striking workers and the owners of the coal company to come to the White House and to try and work it out. Roosevelt's going to be the honest broker between management and labor. That did not go well because of the arrogance of the owners of the coal mines, one of the most important of who was a guy named George Barr, who basically had a nice 18th century paternalistic attitude toward the whole thing. And so he made a statement in which he said, quote, "The rights and interests of laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian gentlemen to whom God, in his infinite wisdom, has given the control of the property interest of this country," unquote. In other words, we run coal mines because God chose us to run the coal mines, and we're gentlemen, and we're refined, and who are the common people to tell us what we should do? We know what's best for them, and they should accept what we tell them. Well, of course, that infuriated Teddy Roosevelt. He didn't believe that people owned coal mines because God had chosen them. God hadn't chosen anybody to do anything on behalf of the American people but Teddy Roosevelt. And so he was not going to stand by and let this continue and let the price of coal soar and endanger the well-being of millions of Americans in that coming winter. So what he did after an attempt at mediation fell apart was to once again go to the press and announce that he was willing to intervene in the coal strike, not by sending the troops in to open the mines back up, by driving out the striking workers and letting the replacements hired by the coal companies come in and take over. No, what Teddy Roosevelt said was that if this strike doesn't end, he's going to send in the troops to seize control of the mines and turn them over to the United Mine Workers. He was going to intervene not on behalf of management, he was going to intervene on behalf of labor. And of course, this was an enormous shock, to the robber barons, and it terrified the likes of J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, who understood that if Teddy Roosevelt was willing to do this to the coal companies and get away with it, then he would probably be willing to do it to oil or steel or railroads or something like that. And so Morgan got a hold of Barr and basically told him, look, you may not be afraid of Teddy Roosevelt, but I know you're afraid of me. And Mr. Barr, if you do not deal with the striking workers and get the president to back off, I will crush you. And of course, Barr understood that J.P. Morgan was as good as a word, and so he backed down. So eventually what happens here is that there's an agreement. Fostered by the White House, whereby the striking workers would come back and begin to produce coal, and a commission would be put together to mediate that gave the workers a 10% raise and a cut in working hours, although it didn't require the coal companies to accept the right of the UMW to govern for them. In other words, neither side got completely everything that it wanted, but for the first time in history, the U.S. government had intervened in a strike as an honest broker, not reflexively supporting management, but willing to consider the position of labor as well. And Teddy Roosevelt says, hey, what we're after here is a square deal for both management and labor. Square deal becomes one of his catchphrases. And so Teddy Roosevelt was, again, putting the U.S. government in the role of mediator, the role of honest broker between management and labor, something that it had never done before, And so when you roll up the fact that Teddy Roosevelt has begun to use the Sherman Antitrust Act to break trust, that he's willing to stand up to the robber barons, that he's willing to be honest broker between management and labor, you have an earthquake in American politics. And this made Teddy Roosevelt extremely popular. And that enabled him to do something that no vice president who had ever assumed the presidency through death or assassination had ever been able to do before, to run for the office in his own right and to win. In 1904, Teddy Roosevelt easily got elected in his own right to the presidency, soundly defeating his Democratic opponent, Alton Parker, 57% of the popular vote going to Teddy Roosevelt. And that's a landslide compared to the 140 that Parker got. Roosevelt got 2,500,000 more popular votes than his Democratic opponent. And so we have left the age behind where the contests for the presidency are, very tight, a handful of votes in a handful of states swing it one way or the other. Teddy Roosevelt wins in a crushing landslide, both electorally and in terms of a popular vote. And that means that he has his own 4 years. So he got basically the 4 years of McKinley's second term. Now he's going to get 4 years of his own. And remember, there's no limit on the number of times a person can run for and be elected to the presidency. The Constitution doesn't put a cap on that at this point. That the cap, the 22nd Amendment, is not going to show up until after World War II. And so who knows how long Teddy Roosevelt might remain president. Remember, he's still relatively young. He's only 47 when he wins the presidency in his own right. And of course, now he believes that he has a mandate from the American people. And so his second term is going to be charged with doing even more things than he had done in his first term, but all of them down the progressive line of trying to regulate business and make life better for the American people. So Roosevelt pushes through, demands from Congress and gets from Congress a wealth of reform measures, railroad regulation, the creation of employers' liability for federal employees, greater federal control over corporations, laws regulating child labor, factory inspections, slum clearance in Washington, D.C., and all of this, of course, becomes the bedrock of Roosevelt's trust-busting reputation. In 1903, he got Congress to pass a law called the Elkins Act, E-L-K-I-N-S, the Elkins Act, which was designed to prohibit railroad rebates and strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission. And it was modern in nature, but now Roosevelt wants to go further, and he urges Congress to empower the Interstate Commerce Commission to set rates and prevent unfair railroad practices, to actually give the ICC the teeth to truly regulate the railroads. And of course that had a lot of support, especially in the Midwest and the far West. And so Roosevelt is going to win here as well. Roosevelt is going to become more and more popular as he goes along. And one of the things, of course, he's going to do is he's going to win for the Interstate Commerce Commission the right not just to regulate railroads, but oil pipelines, express and sleeping car, anything that touched on interstate commerce. Suddenly the Interstate Commerce Commission was going to be able to regulate. So he's expanding the power of the Interstate Commerce Commission, is expanding the power of the federal government. So trust buster, regulator, honest broker. And now he's also going to become the protector of the American consumer. This is something, again, that the federal government had never done before, and under Teddy Roosevelt is going to start doing, and once it starts doing it, it's never going to stop doing it. And here, the initial impulse for this came during Roosevelt's second term in 1906, when a man named Upton Sinclair published a book entitled The Jungle. And this is a great example of muckraking. Remember, the muckrakers are going to, expose the ugly underside of the Second Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age, to the American people. They're going to take the corruption and the unsanitary conditions and the abuse, and they're going to rake it up so that we all have to see it and we all have to smell it. The Jungle is one of the best examples of this that you can find. Now, Sinclair was actually a socialist. He wrote the book to really try to expose how poorly workers were treated in the meatpacking industry, in the great meatpacking, houses and stockyards in Chicago. The work was hard, long, often dangerous, and Sinclair wanted to create sympathy for the workers in hopes that it would produce change in their laboring conditions. But the Jungle actually caused an effect on a different level than what Sinclair wanted. What he does in his book is to expose the conditions in the nation's meatpacking industry. The book was extremely graphic. And it was horribly shocking. I'm going to read you a passage of the book. Apologies if it kind of turns your stomach, but this is a wonderful example of what muckraking is. So this is Sinclair's writing about a visit to one of the meatpacking factories in Chicago, and he goes to look at where the meat is being stored prior to being shipped out by rail to the American consumer. This is what he says, quote, "There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on top of it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put out poisoned bread for them, and the rats would eat it, and then they would die, and then the rats, the bread, and the meat would go into the hoppers together," unquote. It would all be ground up into hamburgers or hot dogs together. And so what was being sold to the American people was not only beef, but a little poisoned bread and a little rat dung and some dead rat as well. And of course, this was a sensation. People read this, they were shocked, they were horrified. This is something that impacts everybody. The meatpacking industry concentrated in Chicago is shipping foodstuffs out across the entire country. So there was nobody that was immune from this product. And so the American people were outraged. The press was outraged. Roosevelt read the book. He was outraged, and he demanded an investigation of the meatpacking industry. And that investigation actually came back and said, Mr. President, Sinclair has written this in a sensational fashion, but everything he says is true. And at that point, President Roosevelt wanted legislation. Now, the meatpacking industry realized this was really bad press. They were willing to give tepid support to milquetoast legislation that would sort of put a fig leaf on all of this. But Teddy Roosevelt looked at the legislation that was being talked about and supported by the meatpackers, and he said, no, that this isn't good enough. I want real reform. And he told the Congress and the meatpacking industry, if I do not get real reform, I'm going to release the report of my administration to the press. And so if you think that the word of a muckraker has freaked everybody out and is hurting your sales, what do you think is going to happen when the United States government comes out and it basically says, it's all true, and here's verifiable proof of it? You will be destroyed. And so the packers had to abandon real opposition. Teddy Roosevelt insisted on a law that had teeth, and once again, the Congress gave it to him by threatening to go to the press and therefore speaking directly to the American people. Teddy Roosevelt got the kind of law he wanted, and that law was the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which required federal inspectors to look at every piece of meat that came through one of these stockyards, one of these meat packing houses, and guaranteed that it was safe before it went out to the American people. So for the first time, the government is protecting the consumer against the unhealthy product of American industry. The federal government has put itself in the role of being there to inspect all of that meat and make sure that it was safe. A visual inspection. We're going to look at it, we're going to smell it before it goes out to the consumer. And this is not a one-off. Teddy Roosevelt is also going to attack the patent medicine industry. So there were people who were making all sorts of drugs, or what they claimed to be drugs, and selling them as medicines to the American people. And they could make whatever claim they wanted. This will cure blindness, this will cure rheumatism, this will cure asthma, or tuberculosis, or it'll regrow your hair, or something like that. You could make any claim that you wanted, and your medicine could contain any ingredient that you cared to put in it. Your concoction could have any kind of plant, it could have any kind of liquid, it could have any kind of compound that you cared to mix together. And most of these patent medicines, as they were called, were really just colored water, or they were liquor, or they were mostly liquor, but some of them had things like cyanide and arsenic, and mercury and lead in them, things that if ingested in large enough quantities could kill you, if ingested even in small quantities over long periods of time could kill you or harm your well-being very seriously. And eventually the muckrakers got a hold of this, and Collier's magazine did an expose on the patent drug medicine and exposed a lot of its products as frauds, or actually dangerous. And so just like Upton Sinclair's book, this got the attention of the president and the federal government, and orders were given to the Department of Agriculture to look into it. And so Dr. Harvey Wiley, who was the chief chemist in the department, bought up a bunch of these patent medicines. He formed what he called a poison squad, and they went into the lab and they dissected these things, and there was again an official report that said, oh my God, most of these things are just liquor and useless, but some of them are deadly. They'll not make you better, they'll kill you. And with this report in hand, Roosevelt goes to the Congress and he demands legislation to curb these abuses. And this time Congress didn't even resist. And the result was the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in June of 1906 that required manufacturers to list certain ingredients on their label. So if you're gonna, put arsenic or cyanide or mercury in your cough syrup, now you have to tell the American people. They get to read that and say, you know what, I think I might not want to swallow this. And of course, these are things the government still does today. The government still inspects meat. The government still, through the FDA, the Federal Department of Agriculture, inspects the drugs and regulates their production and requires the labeling of products and warning. This will grow and grow and grow and grow, but it begins here with Teddy Roosevelt. With the Pure Food and Drug Act, with the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, Teddy Roosevelt has put the federal government in the position of protecting the American consumer from the unhealthy practices and products of American industry. Another place where Teddy Roosevelt is going to give the government a new role is with the environment. Teddy Roosevelt loved the West. He had been a frontiersman. He had been a rancher out west. He was a big game hunter, and he was one of the people who believed in that Frederick Jackson Turner thesis that the frontier was vital to the preservation of the American spirit, and he did not want to see the American frontier, its vastness and its majesty, disappear through lumbering or coal mines or railroad building or that sort of thing. And so Teddy Roosevelt is going to make the federal government responsible for preserving America's natural treasures. And he is what was we call an environmentalist today, but was a conservationist. That was the phrase used at the time. So working with a guy named Gifford Pinchot, who was the chief of the Forestry Service and the Department of the Interior, Roosevelt established the country's first comprehensive national conservation policy. He created the Federal Reclamation Service and created the first Forest Preserve Program in the Department of Agriculture. He placed by executive order potential power sites, coal lands, and oil reserves, as well as national forests in the public domain. In other words, the government is going to protect vast stretches of the wilderness and going to preserve it as wilderness. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be the guy who's going to give birth to the national park system and create national monuments and these sorts of things. You're going to put the government in the role of doing that. When Teddy Roosevelt took office in 1901, there were just 45 million acres of land in government preserves. When he leaves office in 1908, there are going to be 195 million acres of land under government protection. So if we're talking about a presidency that is extraordinarily impactful and influential, it's hard to find one that is more so than Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, for the first time, uses the power of the federal government to bust trust, to curb the power of the robber barons and the giant industries. Teddy Roosevelt, for the first time, puts the federal government in the role of honest broker between management and labor. Teddy Roosevelt, for the first time, puts the federal government in the role of protecting the consumer against unhealthy and unsafe products and practices by American industry. Teddy Roosevelt, for the first time, really puts the government in the role of preserving nature, conserving the majesty of the West. And of course, the federal government still does these things to this very day. There will be succeeding presidents, like William Howard Taft, who will conserve more land, who will bust more trust than Teddy Roosevelt. But what is more impressive? The person who does something for the first time, the person who innovates, the person who pioneers, or the person who follows along and does more. Both are impressive, but most people would argue being the guy who leads the way is the truly impactful person, and that's certainly a role that Teddy Roosevelt had. And if he's going to have it in domestic policies. He's also going to have it in foreign policy as well. And Teddy Roosevelt was just the kind of man who was going to enjoy leading the United States in the period after its rise as a world power and its acquisition of a colonial empire. And he's going to have a motto that's going to speak as well to his domestic as well as his foreign policy. And that motto is "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Speak softly and carry a big stick. Thomas Nast drew a cartoon of a tiny little Teddy Roosevelt, who for a time had been the commissioner of police in New York City, standing at the end of Wall Street in a policeman's uniform, and he was holding a great big stick in his hand, and cowering in fear behind the skyscrapers were a bunch of terrified giants with the names Morgan and Rockefeller and Carnegie and DuPont on them. And it was clear that Teddy Roosevelt was willing to speak softly because he was willing to do things. He could speak softly because people understood that he would carry through on his threat, that he was never bluffing. And that not only worked with domestic politics, it's going to work with foreign policy as well. Speak softly and carry a big stick. Teddy Roosevelt believed that it was important for the United States to take an active role in the world. The time had come. We were this great economic power. We were this beacon of liberty and freedom, the ideas of liberty and freedom, even if we ourselves had not perfected them. We had carried them further along than any other people anywhere on the planet at any point in American history. And we needed to, therefore, be out in the world. We needed to be looking after our self-interest. We needed to protect our trade and commerce. We needed to protect our new colonies, and we needed to spread American ideas and American values as well. And Roosevelt intended to put the U.S. military in a condition to support those foreign policy goals. So having experienced all of the problems of mobilization during the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt saw to it that Elihu Root, his Secretary of War, modernized the Army in the wake of that experience, creating the Army War College, which would be a postgraduate level institution to teach America's officers not only strategy and tactics, but things like industrial mobilization and technological innovation and these sorts of things. There would now be stringent tests for officer promotion. You couldn't just stay in the Army and sit in a rank until you grew old and died, which had always been the habit. Now you were going to have to prove that you were competent for the next rank. And if you weren't, then you were going to be retired. And there was going to be a retirement age. And in 1903, Teddy Roosevelt creates the General Staff to oversee planning and mobilization. These are Army officers and their staff that sit around and think of worst-case scenarios. Where might we get into a war? With who might we get into a war? If we did get into a war, how would we mobilize? What would be the important things that we needed to do? What would be the strategy to pursue? So preparation for wars that you hoped would never happen, in the same way that you want firefighters to constantly be training to deal with one of the skyscrapers in Austin catching on fire. You hope that that never happens, and you expect that it's never going to happen. But if it were to happen, that's not the moment you want the fire department to pull up in front of the building and look up at the 50th floor and say, gosh, we've never imagined what we would do if there was a fire in a skyscraper on the 50th floor. You want them to plan and to prepare for it. And that's what the Army General Staff was going to do. And of course, having been an Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt is not going to neglect that branch of the service. He's going to continue to push for its modernization and its increase. And during his presidency, the Navy is going to double in size. It's going to double in size. Now, one of the problems that the Navy had was that the U.S. has three coasts. We have the Gulf, we have the Atlantic, and we have the Pacific. And we had interest in both of them, and under Admiral Mahan's tenets, we needed to have enough power in both of them to control the seas and protect our coast if necessary. And because there was no easy and quick way to shift vessels from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that meant we had to have a lot more naval power and spend a lot more money on the Navy than we otherwise would. If you wanted to transfer a warship from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you had to sail all the way down the east coast of the northern and southern hemisphere, go around the tip of South America, and then sail all the way up the west coast of Central and South America and North America. In fact, there had been a recent example of how cumbersome that was during the Spanish-American War. When the war broke out, one of the newest and fastest American battleships was the USS Oregon that was sitting on the west coast, and we wanted that ship to travel, to shift from being in San Francisco to Cuba, where we expected all of the big naval battles to happen. So as soon as the war breaks out, the Oregon is ordered to leave San Francisco and get itself to Cuba. It took 71 days for one of the newest, fastest ships in the Navy to make that trip. 71 days in a war that lasted only 113. The Oregon barely got there in time to help blast the Spanish Navy out of the water at the Battle of Santiago Bay. So this was a problem that had always been a quandary for the Navy, and it was a problem that Teddy Roosevelt decided that he was going to solve by digging a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, which is the narrowest point of the Western Hemisphere, a canal that would link the Atlantic and the Pacific and vastly decrease the time required for ships, both commerce and war, to transit from one ocean to another. Now, this was not a new idea. Roosevelt's not the first one to come up with this. Other countries, most notably the French, had tried it in the 19th century, and they had failed. But there are new technologies, steam, powered earth-moving equipment, and there's new science and this sort of thing. And Teddy Roosevelt is determined that he and the United States are going to succeed where the French and others had failed. Now, at this point in history, the Isthmus of Panama is controlled by the nation of Colombia, and so Roosevelt sent his Secretary of State, John Hay, to Colombia to work out a deal that would give the United States the right to build a canal and management. We were going to lease the canal zone for 99 years. It would be a renewable lease. The canal zone would be 6 miles wide, and in exchange for that, the U.S. would pay Colombia $10 million up front and a yearly rental fee of $250,000 a year. Now, that's a lot of money. It was a lot more money then than it is now, but as far as the Colombian Senate was concerned, it wasn't enough. So the Colombian government signed the deal, the Hay-Haran Convention it was called, but it had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate and the Colombian Senate. Now, the U.S. Senate wasn't going to be a problem, but the Colombian Senate was worried. It was worried. It didn't think enough money was being paid, but it was really worried about maintaining Colombian sovereignty. The Americans show up, they're going to build this canal zone, and you really think their influence is going to stay there. Look at American history. These people have constantly expanded this idea of manifest destiny. Before you know it, they might take over the entire Isthmus of Panama, and to keep that from happening, we would rather not have the money or the canal. So the Colombian Senate rejected the treaty, and that outraged Teddy Roosevelt. Not only was this denying him something that he thought was necessary for the defense of the United States and good for world commerce, the idea that Colombia, which was populated by what he called, quote, contemptible little creatures, unquote, would deny the United States of America and Theodore Roosevelt the right to build this canal. Absolutely not. These people were not going to be allowed to say no. Roosevelt was going to do what was in the interest of the United States. That he was president of the United States. He was in charge of doing what was in the interest of the American people and the United States government. And for a time, he toyed with the idea of simply going down there with the military, seizing control of the Isthmus of Panama, and then building the canal, which of course would have provoked a war. But then he came up with a more legitimate means of getting what he wanted. Panama had not always been part of Colombia. Panama, populated by Panamanians, was a conquered province under control of Colombia. And the Panamanian people did not like being under Colombian rule, and Roosevelt knew it, and so he came out and he made a speech in which he said that the United States would look favorably upon any effort by the Panamanian people to gain their independence. So the president comes out and says, we would look favorably upon an effort by the Panamanian people to gain their independence from Colombia. So hint, hint, the Colombians, of course, understood what Roosevelt was saying. They rose up in rebellion against Colombia. The Colombians prepared to put down that rebellion, at which point an American cruiser, the USS Nashville, showed up on the coast of Panama. Roosevelt recognized the creation of the newly proclaimed Republic of Panama, and Colombia was forced to back down. 2 weeks later, there was a treaty between Panama and the United States, which gave the U.S. control of a canal zone now 10 miles wide, in exchange for which we paid Panama's new government the same money and the same rent that we had promised Colombia. Work on the canal zone began at once in 1904. It was an incredibly complex and difficult project that was going to have plenty of challenges that had to be overcome along the way. Engineers, American engineers for the most part, with an army of mainly Jamaican laborers, are going to have to conquer incredibly difficult terrain, jungles, landslides, horrible climatic conditions. You're even going to have to find a way to overcome yellow fever itself by basically spraying oil on any standing water in which mosquito larvae might breed. But eventually, that is going to pay off. And in mid-August of 1914, the first ocean-going steamer is going to sail through the Panama Canal, which was a marvel of engineering, skill, endurance, and technology that it cost the United States $375 million to build. Now, by the time that the canal was finished, Roosevelt is out of office. The world is going to slip into a world war in the same month and year in which the canal is opened up. But all that aside, Roosevelt was as proud of this achievement as anything else he did as president of the United States. And there were a lot of people who criticized Roosevelt for what he did, for intervening in the internal affairs of Colombia, for rattling the American saber, for threatening war, for manipulating the Panamanian people. All of this they considered to be unsavory and unethical, in violation of international norms and rules. But Teddy Roosevelt didn't care. He wasn't the president of Panama. He wasn't the president of Colombia. He wasn't the president of the world. He was president of the United States, and his job was to do what needed to be done for the American people, what was in the American interest, and the canal was in the interest of the United States. It would be good for the world. It would be good for world commerce and world travel as well, but the real motivation here was to strengthen America's defense and strengthen America's economy. And Roosevelt would make no apologies for doing that or the way that he went about doing it. He was interviewed in 1911 and asked about the methods that he'd used to get the right to build the Panama Canal. And this is what he told the reporter, said, quote, "If I had followed traditional conservative methods, I would have submitted a dignified state paper of 200 pages to Congress recommending that we negotiate with Panama to build a canal. And the debate on that paper would be going on yet." So this is in 1911. Remember, he gets all this done in 1904. The debate would be going on yet. We would be, 7 years later, and Congress would still be arguing. But, Roosevelt goes on, but I took the canal zone and let Congress debate. And while the debate goes on, so does the canal, unquote. In other words, the ends justify the means. Roosevelt saw something that was necessary, and he moved decisively to make it happen. And did that mean that he bullied Colombia? It absolutely means that he bullied and intimidated Colombia. But was he looking out for the interest of Colombia? No, he was looking out for the interest of the United States. And if Roosevelt had bullied Colombia, had he not also done Panama a favor? The Panamanians got their own country, even if it was a country that was influenced heavily by American interest and American business, they got their independence and their freedom. So in their eyes, Teddy Roosevelt is a hero. In the eyes of the Colombians, he's a villain. There are flip sides to every coin, after all. But as far as Teddy Roosevelt was concerned, he didn't care. He had done what was best for the American people. And he's going to do that in other ways. One of the great dangers to American dominance and interest in the Western Hemisphere was the debt that was owed by a lot of Latin American countries who had borrowed heavily from European banks and European countries in order to try and modernize, and that money had usually not been well spent or had been spent ineffectively. And so you have a lot of former European colonies who are deeply in debt to European powers. They cannot pay that debt. And of course, the way that that was dealt with at the dawn of the 20th century was to bring military power to bear, to force those debts to be paid. So you would send your navy, you would blockade the problematic country's ports, and then force it to pay up or force it to make concessions to hand over harbors or coal fields or other valuable property from which the creditor nation could extract the wealth that was owed it. And of course, these kind of arrangements very often led to permanent influence of these powers in what were theoretically independent countries. In the same way that they had gained spheres of influence in China, it was highly possible that England and Germany and Italy or France could gain spheres of influence in the Western Hemisphere, which of course was unacceptable to the United States. We had always favored getting the colonial entities of these great European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. We had cheered every time there was a successful revolution in Central or South America that threw off the colonial yoke. In 1823, President James Monroe had issued his famous Monroe Doctrine that basically said the United States would permit no new European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And although at the time the U.S. had not really been in a position to enforce it, by the dawn of the 20th century, we most assuredly are in a position to enforce it. And in 1902, when Venezuela defaulted on its national debt and provoked the English, German, and Italian governments to issue an ultimatum and to establish a blockade of Venezuela's ports until Venezuela paid up what it owed, there was a real threat that you were going to have one of those instances where the European powers were going to punish Venezuela by coming in and taking over the country or seizing harbors and ports or coal mines and oil fields and these sorts of things, and establishing a presence that would give them, in essence, a sphere of influence from which they could never be evicted. Roosevelt wasn't going to let that happen, and so he intervened to end the crisis. Basically, the U.S. paid up Venezuela's debt for it. We forked over the money that the Europeans were demanding so that they had no excuse to stay and they would leave. But having sort of diffused this threat, Roosevelt decided that he was going to make sure there was never a reoccurrence, that these kind of problems were not going to happen again. And so in 1904, when the Dominican Republic basically was going down the same path, Teddy Roosevelt issued his famous corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, an addendum, an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine did was to warn Latin American countries to keep their affairs in order. Keep your affairs in order or face U.S. intervention. In other words, we're not going to wait for the Europeans to come in and seize control of anything or establish a sphere of influence to make you pay your bills. If we see that that's where this thing is going, we're going to step in and take control to make sure that's going to happen. If there's going to be intervention in the Western Hemisphere, it's going to be by the United States. We're not going to give the European powers the excuse to do it. And Roosevelt was good to his word. When the Dominican Republic went and defaulted on its debt in 1905, he sent U.S. officials to take control of collecting the country's customs duties and to make sure that the Dominican Republic got current with its debt, and to further guarantee that U.S. interest in the Caribbean and Latin America in particular were secure, Roosevelt established protectorates over Panama and Cuba in 1907. So basically the U.S. threw its arms around Panama and Cuba, which were independent countries where Americans had significant economic and military interests, and he said anybody who wants to mess with these two countries is in essence messing with the United States, which of course was going to keep those countries safe, but also keep them under the dominance of the United States. And by the time that Teddy Roosevelt is president, of course, it's not just in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, that the U.S. has interest. We now have a Pacific interest as well. We have had for some time because of trade, but after the Spanish-American War, you have American colonies in the Philippines, American possessions at Guam, an American territory in Hawaii. You've got American interest in Samoa, and you've got Midway. We annexed a little island called Wake, which was between Guam and Midway in 1899, and protecting all of this was very important, and protecting American trade with the Orient was important as well, especially after, in essence, the failure of McKinley's open door policy. And although that was still ideologically and politically speaking the official American policy, Teddy Roosevelt had come to realize that it was not going to work out the way that McKinley had hoped, to get all the European powers to play fairly with each other and to play fair with China and their spheres of influence. After the Boxer Rebellion, that was not going to really happen, although a lot of lip service was going to be paid for it. Roosevelt was going to have to play the game differently. So Roosevelt, who inherits the Philippine-American War from McKinley, deals decisively to win it. He sends over lots of troops. He sends Taft over there to take charge, and he applies the necessary military and economic pressure to bring that war to a successful conclusion. In the Far East, Germany, or rather Russia, and Japan were rivals for dominance over the Korean Peninsula, and a good chunk of the southeastern coast of China. That had led to war between the two powers in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan, a much smaller country in terms of population and military force, decisively beat the Russians. It destroyed two Russian fleets, and it drove the Russians out of Korea, and then besieged their great naval base at Port Arthur and forced its surrender. The Japanese had won the war pretty decisively, but of course Russia's a big country with a big population, and even though it had been beaten and humiliated by the Japanese, it had, if it wanted to, the ability to continue the war almost perpetually, whereas the Japanese were running out of money and they were running out of men. So both parties wanted to bring an end to the war. The Japanese, because they were at the end of their resources. The Russians, because they were being humiliated, and this wasn't helping the political situation at home. But neither one could actually bring itself to ask the other to conclude hostilities. And so Roosevelt was willing to step in and become the honest broker between these two warring nations. And in August of 1905, he hosted a peace conference in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the Portsmouth Peace Conference, which ended the war in a way that left the Japanese the dominant power in the region. And for this, Teddy Roosevelt becomes the first man to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Teddy Roosevelt is the first American president, the first human being to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And that's all as a result of his efforts at the Portsmouth Peace Conference. And it's sort of ironic because Teddy Roosevelt was one of the most militaristic of all American presidents. He loved all things military. He's a war hero. He's willing to rattle the American saber and deploy military force wherever necessary to make sure that American interests are protected and America gets what it wants. This is why his foreign policy is called gunboat diplomacy. Teddy Roosevelt was always willing to send the troops or to threaten to send the troops. And therefore, it's kind of ironic that he is a winner of a peace prize. But maybe this is, if you become famous as a warrior or a militarily inclined person, and then you help make a peace, you're going to surprise everybody so much that you're going to be given a very prestigious prize for that. But here's the thing about Teddy Roosevelt's use of gunboat diplomacy. Because everybody knew that Teddy Roosevelt would send in the troops, that he would be willing to go to war to get what he wanted, Teddy Roosevelt almost never had to fight anybody. He's going to finish the Philippine-American War, and he's going to intervene in places like the Dominican Republic and issue the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and these sorts of things, but he's never actually going to have to send the troops into combat because people knew that he would, and therefore they would not call his bluff. They were willing to give in to his demands because they knew that if they didn't, there would be a fight, and that fight would probably not work out to their advantage. And so gunboat diplomacy in some ways is a misnomer. The threat of the use of force, the willingness to use force, means that you very seldom, if ever, had to actually use it. And another example of that is in the aftermath of the Portsmouth Peace Conference, the United States signs an agreement with Japan in which we recognize their dominance over the Korean Peninsula, which was then part of China. This is a clear violation of the open door policy. We don't want any more of China colonized or carved into spheres of influence, but Roosevelt is a realist. He believes in real politics. He says, look, it's a done deal. There's nothing we can do to reverse it, so we might as well recognize it. We're going to allow Japan to control the Korean Peninsula, and in exchange for that, the Japanese promise never to attack the Philippines. So we're going to let you have Korea, you're going to let us have the Philippines, and we're going to agree to preserve the Pacific status quo. Now, agreements are just agreements, and they are most useful when it's understood that they can be enforced. So having spoken softly, Roosevelt was desirous of displaying America's big stick, and he did that by ordering the U.S. main battle fleet, its collection of battleships and cruisers, to stage a cruise around the world in 1908. To emphasize the peaceful nature of this cruise, the whole fleet was painted white with gold, trim and all that. It was called the Great White Fleet, and it sailed around the world in 1908 to prove that we could do it. That we could project naval power any place that we wanted to, that we could go visit all of our colonies to sort of warn everybody that we can protect them. It was, of course, a great training exercise as well to take the entire battle fleet, on a worldwide cruise. But it was also there to send a signal to the Japanese that we could project power onto their side of the Pacific if necessary to defend our interest. And so part of the cruise involved a port visit to Tokyo, which was never open to a foreign navy. The Japanese have been forced to come into the modern world in the 1850s when American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry had sailed into Tokyo Bay and forced Japan to open itself up to the world. And that had so deeply humiliated the Japanese that they had embarked upon a crash course of modernization and industrialization, which they had succeeded remarkably in doing in the span of less than half a century, but that was a sore spot for the Japanese, a foreign navy in Tokyo Bay. But the Japanese welcomed the Americans, and there was no trouble because they believed that it was not in their interest to provoke any confrontation, and this was sort of the capstone to Roosevelt's order to send the fleet around the world. And so, although we had acknowledged that the Japanese were now the dominant power in the Far East, we had put down our marker that we were not to be trifled with, even though there was a rivalry there that was going to grow and eventually fester into a world war in the 1940s. At the time that Roosevelt leaves office, American colonies in the Pacific are secure. American access to overseas markets is assured, and therefore Roosevelt had succeeded in what he was trying to do. So Roosevelt had made the United States a power in the Pacific. He had made it even more dominant in the Caribbean and in Latin America, and he had pioneered the Panama Canal, which of course had an enormous impact on America's defense capabilities as well as on world trade. So he was as influential in the foreign arena as he was on the domestic front. And so Teddy Roosevelt, very, very, very important president, and we are not done with him by any stretch of the imagination. But to everyone's surprise, Teddy Roosevelt is going to bow out after 2 terms. He's going to adhere to the precedent established way back in the day of George Washington. And even though Roosevelt could have run for as many terms as he wanted, and he was probably capable of being elected as many times as he wished by the American people, he's going to step aside after 2 terms in office and hand things over to a hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. But that brings us to an end of the Roosevelt administration. We've looked at him in both terms of domestic and foreign policy, so we've looked at him in chapters 23 and 24. And now your 5 questions. These are questions 6 through 10. 6 through 10 of the second section of the course. Okay? And so question number 1, what was the name given to Roosevelt's foreign policy? What is the name given to Roosevelt's foreign policy? Okay, that's question number 6. Question number 7, what is the name of the author who wrote The Jungle, whose expose of the meatpacking industry convinced Teddy Roosevelt that the U.S. government needed to regulate that particular industry? What is the name of the author who wrote The Jungle? What was the name of the author who wrote The Jungle? Teddy Roosevelt is going to put the U.S. in the role of the honest broker by siding with what union? What's the name of the union that Teddy Roosevelt sides with when he puts the government in the role of being honest broker between management and labor? What's the name of that union? The next question, this will be question number 8, right? And number 8, yes, that is correct. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be the first president who is going to bust trust. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be the first president that is going to bust trust. What is the name of the law that he uses to break up what he considers to be bad trust? What is the name of the law that Teddy Roosevelt uses to break up what he considers to be bad trust? Okay. Question number 9. Teddy Roosevelt considered this his greatest foreign policy achievement. Teddy Roosevelt considered the construction of this to be his greatest foreign policy achievement. Okay? And finally, question number 10. question number 10. It was the assassination of this president that made Teddy Roosevelt president of the United States. It was the assassination of this president that made Teddy Roosevelt president of the United States. So those are your 5 questions. As always, write the questions down with your answers and assemble them together in a file to turn in as part of your second test. And that file name, your first name, your last name, test 2 questions. And remember that if you have any questions for me, just want to talk about the material, I've confused you in some way and you need me to clarify, you can always feel free to reach out. I will look forward to hearing from you, and I will look forward to being with you in the next lecture. We're going to look at the presidency of William Howard Taft.